Good evening, Art History 2 class. I hope you are doing fantastically well. Today we're going to talk about the genius that is Leonardo da Vinci. And to show you what a genius he is, I am actually standing inside of Leonardo da Vinci's actually reproduced studio. If you look behind me, you can actually see that almost thing that looks like a United or a flying object, a UFO. That is actually his model for a tank where machine guns would stick out and as it spins around. It's truly inspiring to be in this place. This particular studio, he lived in many different cities, but this one is outside of Florence, Italy, and is spectacular. What most of you know about Leonardo da Vinci is going to be the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, but there's so much more to this Renaissance giant. We even call it someone who's actually as bright. We actually call that individual being a Renaissance man. And specifically, we're talking about that Renaissance man in the terms of Leonardo da Vinci. Now, he is the individual that's going to move us into what we call the High Renaissance, which is really the perfection of Renaissance humanism, empiricism, and classicism, and creating such masterworks as the Vitruvian Man. And so let's begin our journey today. Now, where in the world was Da Vinci? Let's start off with Leonardo da Vinci is not his name. Leonardo is the proper way that we should call him, but I will go back and forth out of habit, calling him Leonardo and calling him Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci means he's from the town of Vinci, and that is because he is actually a bastard son born to a woman out of wedlock who later on he will marry. But this bastard child son from the father is never given the father's name. So that's why we call him Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci is a small little town. Vinci here, his birthplace in blue, is just outside the town of Florence. So Florence is really the main dominant cultural center, and he's in the Florentine Republic. He will spend some of his time in Rome, but he mostly goes north after Florence and works actually in the great center of Milan, and that is actually where the Last Supper is today. Okay. Now, when we talk about Leonardo da Vinci, we really do have to have a conversation because we are talking about one of the brightest men that has ever lived in human history. And so we need to come up with some parameters on what is a genius. So what do you think a genius is? All right, can a genius be a genius just in one field? Or do you have to excel across many fields? All right, and are there such things as a lazy genius? The idea of a genius who just doesn't apply himself. Yes, he might be absolutely intellectually smart, might have a perfect IQ even, and yet just doesn't apply himself in the future. And most people think that you have to have incredible intelligence and make an impact on some level that changes and transforms the world, particularly humanity, for the future, for the better. So some of the geniuses that we often refer to up here in the upper left-hand corner are Sir Isaac Newton. Here we have Aristotle. Many people consider him, if not Leonardo da Vinci, the most brilliant man that has ever lived on the planet, or it's Da Vinci. We, of course, have Albert Einstein, or William Shakespeare that we talked about last time. And over here, our lovely individual Stephen Hawking, who passed away just recently, Harvard and Cambridge professor that basically developed a theory and explained the Big Bang to everyone else. Now, the most brilliant minds in human history, it's a challenge often between Aristotle versus Leonardo da Vinci. Look what Aristotle did, if you remember from Art History 1, the battle between fate versus free will, the idea of developing empiricism and the idea of kind of categorizing the world, the idea of this concept of art criticism leading to plot structure and reversal and recognition. The idea is that God is the immovable mover, the first mover. The idea of empathy and emotion coming across in art, all from one mind. A remarkable life. On Da Vinci's side, over on the right, and that is his own self-portrait as an old man. He revolutionized engineering. He comes up with a theater curtain. He comes up with anatomy, the early development of the scientific method, thought of a machine-based, robotic-based society that's going to lead us into the Industrial Revolution, and even the concept of perfecting the idea of chiaroscuro, the shading from light to dark. If you'll notice the middle circle, that's basically a Venn diagram of what these men what they share. The first one is IDK. If they did not know something, these two men went and found it out. They did not know something, they didn't have that Google, they could go to the library, but they would actually try to figure it out on their own. They were both very empathic. They literally would help one another or help out any citizens as best they could. They had an insatiable curiosity. We talked about them being lifelong learners. Most Fortune 500 CEOs are lifelong learners. Both were willing to challenge authority when they thought the authority was wrong. They surrounded themselves with brilliance. And so they surrounded with themselves with the best and brightest mind, and they were willing to be challenged by those brightest minds around them. They loved to experiment and try new things. They were very open-minded, and they were very adaptable. Something didn't work, they could actually go back and try to fix it in the future. And so these traits are generally considered the 7 traits of a genius, but also of highly successful people. Now, this is based upon a survey as well as some scientific data that was actually in Business Insider Online magazine in 2016. So when we look at these individuals, this open-minded, this planners, I should also mention they're very funny and witty. They're empathic, sensitive how others experience the world. They're very adaptable. They're very curious. They love time to think solo, but they also like that time to think as part of play within the process. That's what we identify when we talk about a genius. These different features all put in the service of humanity. And some remarkable accomplishments will come out then because of this. Now, there can be an argument that the most creative genius in history, and the question we have to ask if you already know or don't know, is how did Leonardo da Vinci, or Leonardo himself, revolutionize our world? And one way then, of course, is with the development of the Vitruvian man, the perfect man based upon Vitruvius with the perfect circle, the perfect square, and perfect masculinity inside. So here's the video dealing with that.
This image of the Vitruvian man, taken from Leonardo's sketches, has become one of the most recognizable symbols of the Renaissance. But why? It's a simple pen and ink drawing, right? Wrong. Let's start to answer this question with a math problem. I know how to calculate the area of a circle. I take the value for pi and multiply it by the radius squared. I also know how to take the area of a square. I multiply the base by itself. But how can I take the area of a circle and create a square with an equal area? This is a problem often called squaring a circle that was first proposed in the ancient world, and like many ideas of the ancient world, it was given new life during the Renaissance. As it turns out, this problem is impossible to solve because of the nature of pi, but that's another story. Leonardo's sketch, which is influenced by the writings of the Roman architect Vitruvius, places a man firmly at the center of a circle and a square. Vitruvius claimed the navel is the center of the human body, and that if one takes a compass and places the fixed point on the navel, a circle can be drawn perfectly around the body. Additionally, Vitruvius recognized that arm span and height have a nearly perfect correspondence in the human body, thus placing the body perfectly inside a square as well. Leonardo used the ideas of Vitruvius to solve the problem of squaring a circle metaphorically, using mankind as the area for both shapes. Leonardo wasn't just thinking about Vitruvius, though. There was an intellectual movement in Italy at the time called Neoplatonism. This movement took an old concept from the 4th century, developed by Plato and Aristotle, called the Great Chain of Being. This belief holds that the universe has a hierarchy resembling a chain, and that chain starts at the top with God, then travels down through the angels, planets, stars, and all life forms before ending with demons and devils. Early in this philosophic movement, it was thought that mankind's place in this chain was exactly in the center. Because humans have a mortal body accompanied by an immortal soul, we divide the universe nicely in half. Around the time Leonardo sketched the Vitruvian man, however, a Neoplatonist named Pico della Mirandola had a different idea. He pried mankind off the chain and claimed that humans have a unique ability to take any position they want. Pico claimed that God desired a being capable of comprehending the beautiful and complicated universe he had created. This led to the creation of mankind, which he placed at the center of the universe with the ability to take whatever form he pleases. Mankind, according to Pico, could crawl down the chain and behave like an animal, or crawl up the chain and behave like a god. It's our choice. Looking back at the sketch, we can see that by changing the position of the man, he can fill the irreconcilable areas of a circle and a square. If geometry is the language the universe is written in, then this sketch seems to say we can exist within all its elements. Mankind can fill whatever shape he pleases geometrically and philosophically as well. In this one sketch, Leonardo was able to combine the mathematics, religion, philosophy, architecture, and artistic skill of his age. No wonder it's become such an icon for the entire time period.
And I think one of the amazing things about Leonardo da Vinci then within that process is that he is that Renaissance man. Initially in this class, if you remember, I talked about the idea that one of the amazing things within the arts is that it's one of the most difficult subjects to understand, which challenges many people. They think science and chemistry. And that is the idea that within the natural sciences, in order to understand true art, you have to know how color works. You have to know how you're being manipulated through art, whether that's through psychology, whether that's through the use of line. You have to know who's paying for the art and who's actually benefiting from the art and economy. You need to know who's actually setting up the art and who's in the political power of that time period, so you know political science. You need to know about a little bit about every subject area or a lot about some subject areas in order to understand and truly have an idea of where the arts are going. And one of the things that Leonardo da Vinci teaches us, it's not just the physical, but Leonardo da Vinci was also seen as a very beautiful man and actually absolutely advocated the idea of the in-shape man. And as he thought about the birth of anatomy and the different types of musculature, and himself was active in terms of working out. And so the brain benefits of exercise, Leonardo da Vinci understood it, and he's one of the brightest men in history. We really do want to consider these things. The positives of outdoor exercising are things such as, you can see up here with our cursor, reduces sick days when you are actually at work, boosts the happy chemicals in the brain, so it can actually reduce depression. It improves self-confidence, it improves memory and learning, increases relaxation, note improves memory and learning again, specifically in terms of times of tests, improves communication, motivation, productivity, and it relaxes the strain on eyes caused by artificial lighting. Even back then, that was an issue according to things such as candlelight. So Leonardo da Vinci and his studios, you can see, he was fascinated with how he once saw a bird fly, and he tried to figure it out and just couldn't figure it out. And so what did he do? He actually had a bunch of birds captured, and he actually drew out bird wings, trying to understand how the feathers overlap, what happened. And this invented, or led him to the invention of a semi-successful flying machine. The military technology or the industrial technology didn't catch up, but later on, this is the model for the Wright brother airplane, at least in its initial design. So we're going to see basically more of a glider than of a flyer. In case there's a problem, of course, with the spinning mechanism that he saw in different seeds as they fell down to earth and spun, he actually invented the basic rotary issue that shows up in a helicopter. And in case there's a problem when you're in the air, of course, you're going to need a parachute because you've got to get away as a human to get out safely. His engineering is just unparalleled. Da Vinci actually says in the lower right-hand corner that mechanical science is the noblest and the most useful of all of the disciplines. And so if you have a garage door opener that only works with the pulley method, with the string, or with the ball bearing method, it doesn't matter which one you use. As you can see here, he's basically inventing early ball bearings that allow almost all modern machinery to function in the modern day world. He's going to come up with the original model for the submarine, the machine gun, the crank crossbow, the tank, the cannon, the fire thrower. He's a genius. These weapons are one of the reasons that he probably was able to survive when he was accused of sodomia, or the idea which he went to court for and was relinquished from that court, which was very unusual. Sodomy is the crime of homosexuality. So someone had accused him, and he went to court, and probably because he was a machines manufacturer that probably saved Florence on more than one occasion with his designs, was he able to get off on those charges. He's the individual that first anatomy and specifically names half of the human body systems today in Latin were named by Leonardo da Vinci. One half. So if you ever have to take anatomy and physiology, or if you have to take figure drawing where you actually have to draw the skeleton, you can thank Leonardo da Vinci or curse him, depending on how well you do in the class. Leonardo is also a masterful draftsman. And so if you look, myth is that humans only recently started impacting our world and manipulating resources. That's not true. We see this in all sorts of earlier drawings. As I mentioned before, the reason why we haven't impacted the society that much so far, our population. We didn't have clean running water, which allowed us to live longer. We also didn't have the idea of penicillin and of antibiotics. So up until we developed those two things in the 1830s, 1840s in London for clean water again, and then later on in the 1930s, 1940s for antibiotics as we're moving forward, germs basically kept our numbers at a halt. So even though we wanted to dominate the environment, we never could get enough numbers to do it, unlike now, where in the last, we basically put on 1 billion people on the planet just about every 30 years. So we have had a remarkable kind of growth in the last 200 years. Leonardo da Vinci, you can imagine he did this when he was 13 years old. 13 years old. This is the first Western landscape ever without people. At 13 years of old, this is what he knocks out. It's ridiculous. I also want to show you and have an idea of the different materials that these artists are using. So here's actually the Leonardo's drawing materials, because sometimes you'll see this reddish chalk-like drawing that he uses. Other times you'll see a penmanship like ink that we're used to. So here are the drawing materials of the Renaissance, specifically Da Vinci style.
Leonardo da Vinci produced many hundreds of drawings during his life, many of them of extreme beauty and complexity. And it's incredible to think that he produced them using these very simple ingredients. He would have learned how to draw using a silver point on a wooden tablet. Now, silver won't draw directly on a wooden tablet, so what artists used to do was to get some bone ash and mix it with saliva and rub it onto the tablet. So when dry, this bone preparation can just simply be drawn on with the silver point. And then when you're finished and you want to do something else, wet finger, and you can erase it all. Now, one of the problems with trying to use silver point on paper is that it doesn't write on paper. That's because the paper isn't abrasive enough. So what we need to do is to coat the paper. I'm going to start by putting a little of the bone ash onto my ground glass slab. Now I'm going to add red lead pigment, ivory black, and mix them up. Now add a little bit of water. Ground into a bowl. So now I'm going to add a little bit of glue. It needs enough to bind it all together and create a smooth surface on the paper. So here we have the dried ground. As I bring the silver point across onto the ground, immediately you can see the strokes. But equally, you can draw as cursively as you like. Paper in Leonardo's day was handmade from rags which were beaten to a pulp, and the paper was formed by dipping a sieve called a mould into the vat of pulp. Leonardo, like most artists of his period, would have drawn in ink using a quill pen, much like this, made from a goose feather. So I've had these feathers baking for about an hour in hot sand to harden the end of the quill and to absorb some of the oils. We have to first of all scrape away the membrane from the tip of the quill, cut the quill to a convenient length, about a hand span, and then had to make 2 cuts and then cut the tip square and inscribe a small groove inside the tip of the nib to allow the ink to flow towards the tip.
So that's basically making a modern day ballpoint pen.
Leonardo used was made from oak gall, gum arabic, and iron sulfate. What the quill allows the artist to do is to draw very fine lines when he wants to, and Leonardo used that technique on a lot of his anatomical drawings to get very, very sharp delineations of
and many of those are still used in anatomical
surfaces.
drawing books today.
Equally though, he could use the pen as a means of working out his designs, and it was a very creative process using almost scribbly lines. We've got natural black chalk here, which is very rich in carbon, and we've got natural red chalk, which is rich in iron. And the reason that Leonardo used these materials was to allow him a sort of freer style of drawing. It's quite hard with this kind of chalk to achieve the delicacy of line that you see, for example, in Study of the Man from Behind. We're now going to try the black chalk, and this is a good deal harder. And this is much more like the quality of material that Leonardo had available to him. Leonardo frequently used black chalk as an underdrawing to some of his ink drawings, particularly the anatomical drawings. Leonardo used watercolors a lot in his maps. The watercolors.
You just think about the range of not just materials, but also of subject matters that he's drawing
nowadays. And they consist of a ground pigment and gum arabic. the gum water is added slowly until you get a very thick paste. And that's poured into some container. And artists in the Renaissance period used shells, somewhat like this. This is a freshwater mussel shell. Leonardo's constant experimentation with materials and form show his genius, straining to express the product of his imagination. Understanding how these works were produced brings us closer to one of history's greatest creative minds.
And not only is he a master here then, but he also invents his own musical instrument. I mean, the man is a genius in everything. And so he invents the theater curtains. So the idea when the theater curtains open, that is also a Da Vinci instrument. And the stringed instrument he invented here is a combination of a viola and an organista. And so for one night only, I would like to play what this would have actually sounded like. So here's that musical instrument. This is the Leonardo da Vinci combination instrument.
Jestem po prostu oczarowana tym, co słyszałam. Oczywiście.
It's just truly remarkable as an individual. Now, from humble beginnings, you can see the studio that I'm in. Actually, let me pop it up here. Studio I'm in is actually the studio right behind me. Leonardo da Vinci's birthplace is right over here on the right, and that actually is the home where he was born and raised. Later on, he becomes super famous, super wealthy from the Renaissance. Everyone excels and knows about his genius and what he's able to do. And so here in Florence, you can actually, this is his home, his residence for a while, outside of Florence. You can actually stay in the Leonardo da Vinci bedroom, which of course they have a model of his bed, but not the real bed, at least the mattress, and it costs about $400 a night. But if it's worth the idea of trying to get inspired by Leonardo da Vinci, one of the brightest men in history, then clearly it's worth it. He's brilliant. And finally, at the end of his life, where he lives in a mansion, basically in Milan. And so he literally goes from humble origins to superstar, rags to riches, because of his mind. He starts off in the studio of a man named Verrocchio. So he is the apprentice, but very quickly from the apprentice, at about 7 or 8, he is the best apprentice, even after people who have been there 8 or 9 years. He is considered absolutely gorgeous as a little boy as well, and he is actually even used oftentimes by Verrocchio as the model whenever he needs to show an image of the tiny David, or whenever he has to show a beautiful boy or a beautiful son. Later on, he's going to make a self-portrait. So Vasari even says about Da Vinci, his outstanding physical beauty, he's beautiful in person and in grace. Now, as we think about Da Vinci, and we talked about him being a genius, all the things he's inspired, from an HBO star show about Da Vinci's demons, to modern day interpretations, to cartoons about Da Vinci. First off, he's left-handed. That's a problem during the Renaissance and earlier, because left-handed, the Latin word is sinistre. It's actually where we get the word sinister from. He loved pink and orange clothes, which were outlawed in Florence. He didn't actually care. He wore them anyway. His mind worked faster than his body, and it's led him to have lots of incomplete projects. He was accused of sodomia, probably saved by his weapons manufacturings. He is actually illegally dissecting the human corpse, which was illegal because it was still God's highest creation. He basically invents anatomy this way. He's one of the first animal rights activists and one of the first vegetarians ever based upon the morality of killing animals. And he's born out of wedlock. He truly lives an absolutely extraordinary life, getting the lot he was actually given. And one of his most famous, maybe the most famous painting outside of the Mona Lisa in the Sistine Chapel in world history is The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. Now, first off, I apologize that this is not in very, very uber sharp focus, and that's because this is the quality of what the painting looks like today. At one point during World War II, this was bombed accidentally in Milan into the largest jigsaw puzzle in human history, involving somewhere around 10,000 different pieces, and slowly it's been put back together. So here you can actually see the church where it actually took place, and this is the Last Supper wall, basically in remnants and in tatters. They have to start putting it back together. Some of the pieces are lost, and that's why we end up with different little pieces where we can't see anything. All right. Now, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, he challenges the way the Last Supper had been depicted before. The Last Supper in early artists such as Giotto puts all the men wrapped around a table, or even to show how bad Judas was, would put Judas, the bad apostle, on the other side of the table. That's not how Leonardo da Vinci composes it. This largely because he goes back and reads the Bible, make sure that he has a thorough understanding of the biblical text when he's creating this. This, though, in his understanding of the biblical text, is even going to bring him in conflict with the Pope at the time. If we were to archaeological today do a reconstruction of the Last Supper, they wouldn't have even had a table. They would have sat around like this. And here's the Renaissance understanding of that Last Supper that we see in such artworks as Giotto. So if we have a slightly cleaned up version that shows up here, and this is our best estimate on what we have in terms of the color palette, the size of the room, you will notice a couple of things. So this is the restored version. We have to be careful because it's not actually how it looks. When we do and look at the Last Supper, we need to know the biblical text that Leonardo was relying on. And so you'll note there's going to be unleavened bread, which means flat. It's going to be a Passover, so it's a Friday night dinner. It's going to be sunset, 12 apostles, and all the apostles are male with him. Before I suffer, he took the cup, so he's going to need a cup. He said thanks, and he divided amongst themselves. So we either need one cup, but most likely if we divide it amongst ourselves, we're going to need 13 cups. This is my body. He's holding up bread. So we're going to need at least one piece of unleavened bread, or many, or 13. He's going to say, this cup is the New Testament in my blood. So the cup in front of Jesus, we're going to have wine inside of. And then he's going to say, the hand of him that betrayeth me is with me on the table. So we've got to look for some connecting hands. And there's going to be a strife, a reaction that actually shows up between them. So what features would you expect to see in the Last Supper that we talked about? We're going to need 13 men. We're going to need at least one cup. We're going to need unleavened bread. We're going to need lamb is actually what is served at a Jewish Seder. We're going to need at least one cup, if not 13 cups. And the problem is almost everything is wrong. If you look at the biblical accuracy versus Da Vinci's, yes, a last meal is emotional. We are going to have an emotional meal. Number of people, we're going to have 13 if you count them in. Number of men, 12 in biblical accuracy. Apostles, 12 plus 1, Jesus. We're not sure if one of these figures is male or female, so that's one of the speculations we've got to talk about. Time of day, it's clearly not sunset or sundown. It's noon. The bread should be unleavened. They've got dinner rolls. Look at how they stick up. The type of meat is lamb. It's actually going to be fish. It's right here. Number of cups, 13. There's 12 cups. Ironically, the one person who needs the cup to say, this is my body, does not get a cup. So everything seems to be slightly off. And so the secret of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper to begin with is it even a Last Supper? Or is it just lunch? Da Vinci never calls it his Last Supper. He actually calls it lunch. We have referred to it as the Last Supper since then. So the challenge becomes, who is sitting at that Christ's right hand, the power hand? And generally, this is the invention of a triangular composition. Christ himself is one triangle, but then there are three people that make up the other aspects of the triangle next to him. And so one of them is going to be St. John. St. John is very important for Christian message because he gives the Last Supper. This is another St. John image to show you. We're going to see St. John by Leonardo. St. John, another version. This is the one from the actual Leonardo da Vinci Last Supper. And St. John by Giampietrino, a Leonardeschi, or basically a follower, someone who actually follows in the style. Might have even worked in the studio with Leonardo himself. Note the feminine features, the tilt of the head that we see here with the longer hair. Now, if this is St. John, the younger St. John, not St. John the Baptist, generally seen with the beard, he would have been a 14-year-old, right around pubescent kid. So the question we have to ask is this potentially a young prepubescent boy, or alternatively is someone on the verge a female? And that's one of the challenges and one of the questions. The three people that are actually closest to Jesus then, go back one, are all supposed to be these three here. So the challenge is, we have St. Peter, the first pope, that makes sense. We have St. John. Well, if it is St. John, if it's not Mary Magdalene, that's going to be a challenge. And the other one right here, which I'll show you in a moment, is Judas. And that's a huge problem. Remember, Judas is the bad one. He should be on the opposite side. Now, in Italian, the Last Supper is known as Ultima Cena, and that's how we'd refer it to. Da Vinci's style is in cena colla. place where people eat, but sometimes reference to the Last Supper. And it actually was where different people from this church would eat. Later on, as strange as this sounds, the value of this painting was not that great. So little was thought about it that at one point they actually see how all the apostles here have legs. They thought that walking out of the building and walking into the next door over was too much of a hassle. So they cut Jesus's legs off and they walked right through the door. And that's what they're looking at. So we come up to the idea of boys behaving badly. Here's Judas. Remember, typically shown farther away from Christ on the opposite side of the table. And the Leonardo da Vinci said, no, that's just not the case. He is one of the most important Christian apostles, maybe the most important Christian apostle, even more than the first pope, St. Peter, where St. Peter is actually buried in the Vatican today, and it begins the papacy and spreading the word along with Paul to Europe. He says, no, Judas is more important. And the Pope eventually is going to call him before, and basically, this is a man who's believed to have the power to send you to hell. And so Leonardo da Vinci is going to be asked, why put Judas so close to Jesus? He is the evil, and he should be away. And Leonardo da Vinci has a bunch of answers, but his first answer strikes the Pope. The Pope has to go back and understand, really think about it. He says, Pope, without Judas, you are still a Jew, right? Because without Judas, the crucifixion never happened. The Romans never kind of get the right individual. And so that's what he's actually thinking and looking at. And so he challenges the Pope, so much so that he knocks over the salt cellar here. Boys behaving badly as he grabbed to the pieces of silver and gold. Now, Leonardo da Vinci, while he does that, makes sure that you know that Judas is a bad guy. And he does this by, on some level, making Judas look the most Jewish. Remember, Judaism and Jewish individuals were looked at very hesitantly with very many problems because, number one, they were the money lenders, the users that had set up banking that actually hurt individuals. And so Judas clutches the money bags. He's knocked over the salt fish, which is a bad omen. This was Da Vinci's own idea. He has money bags that are reference to greedy Jewish stereotypes. Jews were forced to wear a yellow badge even back then, which symbolized a coin and usury. That's where the original idea before the Nazis ever got to it was that they were lecherous and they would take everyone's money. As salt was a cured meat, it was more valuable than gold. And so the idea that he knocked over salt here and is wasteful shows that how little value he actually has for money. And Da Vinci understood about the idea of limited natural resources that we're dealing with today. And he feared not being able to cure meat in the future as the population increased or as war came up. Jesus even says, you are the salt of the earth. And here he is wasting it, a human wasting it. So all negative aspects that were referred to him as Judas. The other way is we're going to belittle Jews as the treacherous apostle. We're going to stereotype the Jews because they were hated because of usury. They also killed Jesus Christ. That was believed during the time period. And they funded the Crusades. So if you look at the way Judas, even though he was of that first grouping on the right-hand power hand of Jesus, you'll note he's the only figure in shadow. Look at the ferret. He's got a Jewish hooked nose. He's got the features of a thief that Leonardo da Vinci painted or saw and took note of in the Thieves' Quarter of Milan. His costume was even painted with a cheaper material, azurite, that was 30 times less expensive than any of the other saints, and the lowest head in the apostle. So even though he puts him in that first triad, he very much is shouting out that Judas is the bad one. Now, the popes behaving badly becomes a major issue. If you have heard that the popes are wonderful individuals and wholly wonderful and kind of doing God's work, this is just not the case during the Renaissance. If you look at here, you have St. Peter with a knife, who literally is reaching back, and you'll see lovely another saint, or apostle, raising up like, I didn't do it, it wasn't me within the process. And this is something that the popes were blamed for. They used strongman, dictator-like tactics. We've had many popes that have been terrible, terrible people. It very much was not a religious institution until much later on, when the Roman Catholic Church is forced to clean up their act in about 1800. It really was a political institution more than anything else. We've had popes, murderers, homosexuals, rapists, people have run drug rings, people have run prostitution rings, they've all been popes. Just to give you an example, here's two. Pope John XII is a serial rapist of virgins. He allows Vatican prostitution. Women were discouraged from visits. and they did an inquiry, and the inquiry warned women not even to come into the Vatican when he was the Pope, because he would fuck his own niece. That's actually what the inquiry says. He castrated a bishop, and he blinded another pope when he was forced out of office. Look at Pope Benedict IX, elected by bribery. He's our first openly gay pope. He had gay animal orgies and poisoned 2 popes after him. These are terrible, terrible people that we have leading a Roman Catholic Church that is really a business much more than something that's promoting the profound understanding of Jesus up until later on. So with all of this evidence, the question for all of you to consider: wrong time of day, wrong meat, potentially wrong placement of individuals. Is this a Last Supper? And that is a decision that each of you will have to make. The one aspect that sticks out, that supports that this is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, is that if you really look at it, the study of tragedy and what is being announced here is very accurate. The study of tragedy is the idea that if someone tells you so shocking, like this is the night your Savior is going to die, and one of his best friends, his apostles, is going to let him go, you're going to get a study of different range of human emotions. So if we look at that, what are our reactions when we're faced with tragedy, when we're faced with these awful tragedies? Whether it's 9/11, whether it happens to be the Last Supper that shows up here, excuse me, genocide during World War II, bombing that shows up. And here are the general reactions that we see, and we do see almost all of them in the Last Supper. We see mild anger, we see sadness, we see the guy going, not me, we see aggressive anger, we see need support, model of calm, threatening anger, sorrow, problem solving on who's responsible. I mean, I love this individual right here. Look, this individual here gets up into Jesus' grill and says, who did it? I will get them for you. And is very angry, very confrontational. So the tragic emotion, Leonardo's Last Supper, we still have them today. And ironically, it is the acceptance of tragic emotions that compel most scholars still to believe it is a Last Supper. That's the one thing. So we have these different kind of apostles with their different reactions, again, in comical ways. It's not me, whistling to myself, because of course it's Judas, really kind of hiding so no one actually notices him. No one would suspect Judas because from the biblical teachings, Judas was Christ's best friend. So why would you suspect Christ's best friend for being the one to betray him? This individual getting in, who's the effing traitor getting close to Jesus? And down here, well, it's not me, it's not me. Well, it must be them. It must be one of them down there, trying to figure out who that traitor could be. Now, this has led this weirdness has led to all sorts of speculation, particularly in Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. And Dan Brown makes some interesting assertions, and some are absolutely true. The first thing says that Da Vinci was a member of a secret society. That's true. Da Vinci is probably a member of a number of secret societies. From the historical evidence, there's a good shot that he's bisexual. There's a good shot, actually, we know he also is dissecting human bodies, doing anatomy experiments at night illegally. And because of that, we know he has to be a member of society. Someone is delivering those bodies to him and taking away after he's done his scientific studies. Okay, absolutely. The figure next to Jesus Christ, so here's Jesus Christ reaching out. Here is the idea then, right here, of Mary Magdalene versus St. John, a young 14-year-old St. John who later on is going to write the book of Revelation talking about the second coming of Jesus. That's absolutely plausible. Look at it, it's feminine. The color match is actually opposite of Jesus. We have a blue cloak, blue dress, this pinkish, and then we have a lighter pink that shows up. That's a very effeminate way. There's no facial hair at all, even though it was a 14-year-old prepubescent boy. It is St. John. That is absolutely plausible, and I have no assertion otherwise behind that. The pink one then, he proposes, the Dan Brown then, in the Dan Brown Code proposes that Mary and Jesus were actually married. Now, there is some interesting kind of scenarios that show up. Dan Brown makes the argument that that V, and goes over here, if you continue it on, represents marriage and like the idea of her virginity or of her kind of holy nature, the way Jesus was born within this process. Now, there are no historical references for this at all, but in this time period, during the Jewish faith, it'd be very unusual for a leader of a Christian church not to be married. And so it's surprising we don't have more details about that, on whether he was married or not, from historical references going back. If he were married, it clearly almost all that evidence had been destroyed. but there's no historical proof within it at all. But it is plausible. Now, here's where Dan Brown jumps off the shark and becomes a problem, because the historical evidence is just not there. That the marriage between JC and Mary Magdalene, again, with no historical evidence, produced a daughter, thus Jesus's genetics were on earth. And that the reason why Jesus does not have a cup, because the cup is actually Virgin Mary, right? The carrier of the pregnancy of Christ's child here on earth. And that's what the Knights Templar, the secret, they were actually trying to protect rather than the actual Holy Grail. And the secret that was guarded was by the Knights Templar, of which Da Vinci, Newton, and Jean-Jacques de Villa, famous artists later on the Renaissance or the Neoclassical period, are all members. That is just something we cannot prove. It is pure speculation. There's no historical evidence behind it, but I can't also disprove it. But it's really hard to disprove a negative. So we do have in the Last Supper, or I should say, and that becomes the understanding of the Da Vinci Code itself. And so Dan Brown's assertion is that the Mary Magdalene here is pregnant with Christ's child, and therefore the M here, the V for the Virgin, but the M here is the idea of marriage and for Mary Magdalene. Now, there is no historical evidence at all, but note, because it's based upon the early assertions, Da Vinci is absolutely a member of a secret society. Could it be Mary Magdalene there because the wrong time of day? It absolutely could. And that becomes one of the challenges when we get artworks that challenge the norm as we go to interpret them. Here are the different saints labeled out. We do know who they are. And here's Da Vinci's original study. Note how different the original study is with people on the opposite side. It was much more the Renaissance style that we have, but note the very effeminate nature then of some of the figures. So we have Bartholomew, James, Andrew, St. Peter's the first pope, St. John, and of course Judas, the bad one over here. Note the lowest saint is St. Judas. If you draw a line, here's how good the mathematics is for Da Vinci. If you draw a line from Judas, which is basically the bad saint, to the tallest saint, which is the first apostle ever, it goes right through Christ's forehead. And that's true if you chose the 2nd and the 11th. It's pretty remarkable on what it's done here. So the Pope hated this triangular grouping, called Da Vinci before the Pope defended himself. And of course, when Da Vinci extends and talks about Judas being so important and the most important saints, along with St. Peter as the first Pope, and St. John or Mary Magdalene, but St. John in particular, that first triangular grouping, as the person who's going to write about the second coming of Christ in the book of Revelation, the Pope has to say, man, he knows his stuff. And so this becomes the standard of the way that we look at the Last Supper today. So this is the new standard that's set up. He's also going to play around with one-point perspective. Note, not develop it, but play around with it, because Brunelleschi in the early Renaissance, this is the high Renaissance, played around with it. And note, it's a little clunky, ironically, considering we've already had Masaccio's Trinity, but in the one-point perspective, you can see it's actually slightly off based upon the tapestries, how far. It's almost as if he painted this beautiful scene and then added a background, or another artist potentially in his studio finished up the background beforehand. The coffers, which should receive at about the same level. No, the spacing is either the same or it's actually in reverse order, which is strange for someone who's actually so focused on the details. So the Last Supper is a summary. He's going to create triangular compositions. It's a realistic exploration of emotions during a tragedy. He's experimenting with one-point perspective. The Judas iconography is established. He placed complementary colors next to each other, which revolutionized color palettes which we had never seen before. And he's challenging Christian ideas of the Last Supper, specifically in the images of Judas, St. Peter, and St. John or Mary Magdalene. This is a tour de force. And what's remarkable, he only has 15 artworks. Remember, he's also got military, scientific, engineering, technology. Really a brilliant individual. This is endlessly spoofed, so inspired. So here's a Last Supper by Andy Warhol on the left, and later on the dinner party by Judy Chicago, which we'll see, which is the foundation of the beginning of kind of feminist art, where there's 13 place settings on the side, but all of them honor very famous women. And Judy Chicago basically says, this is the Last Supper. If the people that were doing the cooking were also doing the eating, because of course there's no women here, and there are going to be women actually that are cooking. multiple different spoofs. You can actually buy this as a Lego set. Here, clearly, Princess Leia is being played out as a female Mary Magdalene rather than as a young St. John. Otherwise, you put Luke in that particular category. Latino Jesus within here, and I don't have any idea what's going on over here.
Hello, my friend at Miami-Dade College, and I hope to see you soon, Professor Fraser at CGIU. He was one of the 100 greatest artworks of all time.
Thank you. That's former President Bill Clinton, who sent us a lovely message introducing us to artworks that changed the world. Bill was a friend of ours from Miami-Dade College. We are a founding member of the Clinton Global Initiatives University, and every year send somewhere between 4 to 10 students to the national conference where they get to meet with worldwide leaders on making the world better. And so thank you very much for introducing. Hopefully I'll get to see him again when the next time I go to CGIU. He was supposed to be in Scotland this past year. All right. You will notice the Italian Renaissance aesthetics. They're exactly still the same as we talked about in the early Renaissance, early high Italian Renaissance. And here's what Mona Lisa and what Leonardo da Vinci says about painting. Painting is a matter of great mental analysis, of greater skill and more marvelous than sculpture. And Michelangelo later on, who's the young kid on the block, is going to take great problems with this. Since necessity compels the mind of the painter to transform itself into the very mind of nature, creating naturalism, a three-dimensional approach on a two-dimensional surface, to become an interpreter between nature and art. And that's Leonardo's trees on painting, arguably the best painter of the time until Michelangelo comes along. His other thing that he says about the Mona Lisa is the following. The good painter must principally paint two things, which are man and ideas in man's mind. This is a call to the artist to make the invisible visible. The human soul should be exposed by the motion and expressions of the human body. And this is one of those first artworks where we actually start looking at this, that the soul force, it's not just a representation, but this says something about the personality of both the sitter as well as the artist that's actually making it. So there's a slight autobiographical feel that shows up. Now, before we get too far within it, there's always been this myth that we don't know who she is. Mona Lisa, we absolutely know who she is. Her name is Lisa Gherardini. She's a 24-year-old woman that's getting married, the wife of a prominent merchant. Most likely what you're looking at is one side of the portrait, one half of the portrait, where the husband's portrait was never completed, probably was going to be the next one up. And so you would have a pair for them getting married. What we do know is that Mona Lisa is the biggest spelling error in human history, because Mona during the time period shouldn't have been M-O-N-A, it should have been Mana, short for Madonna. And so Mana here, it's the biggest spelling error probably ever. If you go to France, her real name is La Gioconda or La Gioconda, which means the merry one or the smiling one. And here's the odd part. Leonardo da Vinci visited with this 24-year-old woman, and he was much older, with Lisa Gherardini at least 20 times over 4 years, which has led many scholars to believe they might be having an affair. This might not just be him trying to get everything right with one of the most influential artworks of all time. There might have been some hanky-panky taking place between these two. Generally, when you would go to visit someone and show them your artwork, you would actually get the idea and show them somewhere between maybe 4 to 5 times. And you would, the first time you would rough out the sketch, get some of the details of the face. You would come back to finish off the physiognomy the next time and maybe kind of work on the clothing. The third time you come back for details, and the fourth time was for very rough details. The fact that he came back 20 times really does speak volumes. And he made very little money on the picture itself because he always brought things to entertain her. A picnic lunch, a jester, musicians. And so there were always entertainments to try to keep that lovely smile going, as he said. One of the things that shows up with Mona Lisa is just simply, where does she look? Now, it all depends on where you look as well. So we're about to teach you something about yourself as well. If you believe that the Mona Lisa is just looking at you, well, first off, you're a narcissist. She's an individual hundreds of miles away. Of course, she can't be looking at you. But ironically, I believe she's looking at me because of the way the shape is. The rest of you will believe that she's looking over your shoulder, this shoulder here. And so if you get up and move around the room, I'd like you to see if she still looks at you over the shoulder or right at you. And the amazing thing is no matter where you move to, she follows you. She follows you. And so how does the master of anatomy, Leonardo da Vinci, achieve this? That her eyes appear to follow you, that if she's looking over your right shoulder, right shoulder, or right at you, no matter where you move in the room, she's still looking over your right shoulder or at you. We actually call this effect today, ironically, Scooby-Doo eyes, based upon this. But how does he do it? Let me go back to, any idea how he does it? It's because if you really look at her eyes, look very closely where we have right now at the large scale. This is a small artwork, which often disappoints people. They expect it to be massive and huge. Her eyes don't line up. She actually has a lazy eye. If you watch my videos, you'll notice I also have a lazy eye along the lines. My eyes don't work together. So I look in one capacity, I see, this is actually the eye I see out of. I look over here, I see slightly things off. My eyes don't work in concert. She actually has the exact same feature that shows up. It's called a lazy eye. And by doing that, he's playing with you. From no historical accounts can we find that lovely Lisa Giardina had a lazy eye or cross-eyed in any way there were any difficulty. So this might be an addition that showed up to really have the viewer follow you around as he's trying to work on the details. There's also a notion out there that it's a self-portrait, which was proposed many years ago in Time Life magazine and has since just been debunked. It just doesn't work. In the Mona Lisa, along with the Vitruvian Man, he is working with the idea of the perfect ratio. That is the golden ratio in Fibonacci sequence of numbers. If you don't know, a Fibonacci sequence is the idea if you take the sum of the last two numbers you add and you put them together, and that becomes the new ratio. So for example, 0 plus 1 is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 plus 1 is 3. 3 plus 2 is 5. 5 plus 3 is 8. And you move up in the Fibonacci sequence with each number divided by the order, and the number you're going to get is 1.618. That is considered the most beautiful ratio, and we see it all throughout nature and all throughout the world. The next thing he's going to do, not to be outdone, is he's going to perfect, not invent, but perfect a new technique that's called chiaroscuro, which is where you take one color and you shade it from light to dark. If you look very closely at great portraits that we looked about 2 weeks ago, called the Portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, if you look at it, you'll note there's one color, this fleshy white color here. There's a darker peachish color here, and a gray that's the base color here. Note here you have that peachy flesh right here, you have that lighter gray, and that white peach. So you have three colors that are actually doing it. If you compare that now to what he's doing here, where you're using one color, and for the highlights you're adding white for tints, and for shadow you're adding black for the shades, you're basically getting a much more three-dimensional, realistic image of the figure itself, because we are not multiple skin toned unless there's a genetic deformity within us. This literally is the way that we're going to invent chiaroscuro. Once chiaroscuro is perfected, we're going to use it on everything. And chiaroscuro then is using the analogous colors that try to relate everything around you, and note how she blends in the background because of it. So this gives us a naturalistic approach. He's also, on top of all of this, going to invent a new technique called sfumato. Sfumato is not the sharp focus, but kind of a misty haze that you see. So not quite in absolute full high detail, high depth contrast that you're going to see with crystalline features. And the reason why, as you can see in Titanic, we often use this when you're falling in love with someone, right? Bodies start to melt together and disappear in love. So we see this a lot in either landscapes that we want to see all romantic and these wonderful, which we see here in the Turner landscapes. We're also going to see those in different figures here as people fall in love with one another. So if you take chiaroscuro and sfumato together, that is what Da Vinci is doing. He's taking flesh tone differences and varying them throughout. At the same time, he's doing the reflection of the original colors that are actually showing up in the shadow, which gets this murky haze that shows up. And so that's the combination of chiaroscuro and sfumato. Both are quite common techniques all the way up into the present day world. Not to be done, what is weird about the background? You'll note the backgrounds don't match up behind her. This background, unless there is something crazy that happens right here, does not match up with this background. Not to mention that over here you have an arcade, which is an aqueduct system. And if you see right there, there's actually a person on a horse right there. This artwork is done with a single horsehair brush. The same way Portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini, his beautiful kind of image that we just looked at, chiaroscuro versus non-chiaroscuro. There is the mirror that's about the size of my hand right here, and that is done with a single horsehair brush. They're taking years to try to get empirical evidence absolutely right, and they're fantastically good at it. Not to be outdone, he's basically popularizing and modernizing the three-quarter yearbook portrait. Probably most of you can identify that we have The Rock, Denzel Washington, Tom Cruise, Beyonce, Selena Gomez. And so the idea that the woman looks out at you is also a challenge. So all these are new features. It's quite remarkable. The figure looks out at you, and basically what she's doing is she's challenging gender roles. The only women that looked out before and saw you before were those individuals, those women in some capacity that were trying to attract business. It's basically the mark of a prostitute. And that's why in this one, she not just winks, but she also gives you that red lipstick was also a mark of a prostitute in many times throughout human history, whereas girls generally did not wear that bright. So we're challenging this. Now, guys, we all know this. You walk into a club, you're looking around, and a woman looks at you and gives you this little half smile. She's interested, or at least she's just trying to be nice. That's what girls say. But the guy interpretation is she's interested. It's an interesting look for her to look at the artist like this. Now, in the future, this painting is only going to show up supposedly in her bedroom, so only her husband or her kids would get to look at her like this with this slightly flirtatious, almost seductive way, because women did not make eye contact. Go back and look at the portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini. Even when they're getting married and putting their hands together, the woman's eyes are down at the man's shoes. So we have multiple stylized beauty then going throughout history that's based upon the Mona Lisa. She was considered a real beauty. The eyebrows of two different interpretations. One, eyebrows did get very thin or shaved during the Renaissance as a mark of beauty and a high forehead. Or number two, it might have been taken off with a later cleaning. We don't actually know the difference between the two of those. Where has the Mona Lisa resided? Some strange places. First off, she started off in Leonardo da Vinci's studio. She then ended up in Napoleon's bedroom because Napoleon bought, or I should say the French king, bought this lovely artwork from Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci, when he was done making it, never delivered the commission, even though the commission was paid for. He took it, because it's very small, underneath his arm, and he went to a new town, to his home in Milan. So it went from here to his home in Milan. Of course, the husband wanted that back and tried to petition the courts. But there is not international laws, and these are separate city-states, not a national law that can actually get it back. Later on, at the end of his life, he's going to sell it, Leonardo da Vinci, to the King of France for a multi-buttload of money that in today's money would be about $500 million. When Napoleon, when he gets married to Josephine, Josephine doesn't like the way he looks at this beautiful portrait over and over in her bedroom, so she asks him to remove it, and eventually he removes it. Weirdly, he puts it in his own bathroom. So when he goes into the bathroom, this is what he looks at, which has to ask some interesting questions that show up. And finally, it's actually put in the Louvre, which is Napoleon's palace, but becomes the official art museum where it currently is today. Every couple of years, the family that originally paid for the Mona Lisa asks for it back from the Louvre and petitions a legal court case. But of course, as we talked about in Art History 1, the law is if you own the artwork before January 1st, 1921, the artwork is yours. And so the Louvre doesn't even respond back to those claims. This is one of the most spoofed, but also inspired artworks of all time. And in art history too, we really do have to talk about the challenges that show up with art that kind of impact the world around us. So are these inspired artworks also great works of art? This is Marcel Duchamp, who took a poster, Didn't even take the image of himself, took the poster and actually added on within 5 minutes and called it LHOOQ, basically a French anagram for the word look. And then Mona Lisa, 30 Mona Lisas are better than one. So in the age of mechanical reproduction, what does it mean to be a great artwork? As a review, look at all the firsts in this one artwork. Chiaroscuro shading from light to dark, the three-quarter yearbook pose, the Scooby-Doo lazy eye, the atmospheric perspective, which is perfected here, the sfumato smoky haze for romanticism, the background sets which aren't accurate. We didn't mention this has foreshortened hand. He's trying to work in three-dimensional depth and make you basically look like you're looking out a picture window, or you're looking out a window and she's on a balcony overlooking a landscape. The eye gaze and movement challenges the gender roles, and smile change gender roles. If you've ever heard the phrase Mona Lisa smile, it is reference to during World War II, the Mona Lisa and other priceless artworks were taken out of the Louvre for fear that Hitler, who was a great art collector, might take them. So they were hidden somewhere in southern France. The place where they were hidden is actually Lascaux Caves, which had recently just been discovered and was a nice controlled climate environment. So if you've ever heard the phrase, the Mona Lisa is smiling, or Mona Lisa smiles, or Mona Lisa smiling, it all refers to the idea that the artwork was safe during World War II. And this has inspired many songs, including this lovely song called Mona Lisa. We have all sorts of spoofs. The Mona Lisa after 1 week, Mona Lisa with plastic surgery. You can, of course, buy a Lego figure with the Mona Lisa. We have Daisy Duck, Miss Piggy. We have her showing up everywhere. She's one of the most spoofed artworks on the planet. And Leonardo da Vinci's artwork then, because there are only 15, becomes some of the most valuable artworks on the planet. Here's the story of the journey of Da Vinci, Salvator Mundi, which eventually was authenticated very recently as being an actual old master of Leonardo da Vinci. And so you'll notice there's one place up here in 1958, this artwork sold for $90 out of an auction that showed up, and the authorship was unclear. That was 1958. We've now done research and gotten much better at identifying it. And so today that artwork sold for $450.3 million. It's worth $500 million in sales. And in 1958, if you go back in a time machine, you could have bought it for $90 US. It's remarkable what you find in people's closets these days. And here's a summary for an AP exam that a student did. And here's a question while this goes on. Why is Leonardo da Vinci considered one of the three most important artists ever?
Musician and the writer and the opportunist, architect and engineer are also on the list. Da Vinci. Oh, he gave us the Mona Lisa, the last supper and the Vitruvian man. If anyone can do it, Leonardo can. Oh, he wrote all his features in the journal he had, but he wrote it all backwards to make us mad. That's the Vinci. And there's some kind of code if you take a closer look. I tell you all about it, but I haven't read the book.
And of course, this is being made into a major motion picture right now, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, who is actually named for Leonardo da Vinci. And so that ends our lecture on Da Vinci. If you have any other questions, please let me know. Have a wonderful day. I'm thrilled that I get to introduce you into one of the brightest men that have ever lived on the planet, Leonardo da Vinci. Bye.